Good morning. I'm Luke Mize. Today we're going to talk about wildlife conservation among hunters and anglers. So a lot of times people may think that these two subjects collide with each other and clash, and they actually don't. Hunters and fishermen have been at the forefront of wildlife conservation for pretty much the entire existence of the concept. So real quick, let's rewind and imagine that you're a young fella, you're born in the mid-1800s, and you travel out west and you do what you've dreamed of for as long as you can remember, which is hunt a wild buffalo in the American West. Something that can't get much more iconic to a hunter than that. You're successful, and you go back to your home in New York, and for a couple of decades, you dream about going on another buffalo hunt. When you finally get to return as a grown man, you discover something that's horrifying to you, and that's the fact that the herds of buffalo, which once numbered in the millions across the American West, are pretty much extinct, and they're non-existent. That story is actually true. It happened to a man that would become the President of the United States later in his life, and that was Theodore Roosevelt. After seeing that, he returned home, and through numerous efforts with others, would become the face of the North American conservation movement in the early 1900s. Alright, so what is wildlife conservation? Wildlife conservation is simply the practice of protecting wild animals and plants and preserving their existence in the natural habitat where they should be. And this is Wikipedia's definition, so it should be fairly simple and upfront, correct? Well, a couple issues. Plants are definitely part of conservation. They often get overlooked, so let's remember that. The second thing to note here is that we're actually talking about plants and animals in their natural habitat. So we're not talking about putting an animal in a zoo and saying, hey, we have conserved this animal because we have a specimen here. No, we want to be able to interact with these animals and view them in their natural habitat just as if there were no human involvement in the process. There are two basic models. The first one is the North American model, and the second one is the European. The North American model holds that all wildlife is owned by everyone. In other words, you can't lay claim to a specific animal just because you own the land that it's on or you hold rights to hunt that particular animal. They're owned by everyone. Because of this, wildlife has to be managed by the states and by the federal government. The majority of the time this burden is going to fall to the states, but in certain times the federal government will come in and place regulations on them. In contrast to the European model, if you're the landowner or you have rights to hunt the particular lamb or fish the particular stream, you own that animal or you own that fish. So because of these differences, it's really going to shape how we need to view wildlife in North America. All right, so why do we need wildlife conservation in North America? Well, the late 1800s through the early 1900s, you saw a large increase in the population of the United States and North America in general. As the population increased, our demands for meat and our demands for protein increased. Again, you got to think this is before commercial farming. Prior to this, farming was essentially a family business. You farmed just enough for your family to survive. So as populations increased, we started relying more on wild game. Market hunting would lead to actual numerous near extinctions, including most large mammals, deer, elk, bear, some of the species that are most coveted by hunters today. In other words, they want to hunt that particular species because they love interacting with it. Those species were largely affected by the market hunting. Ducks and geese, another particular problem, they were hunting for feathers and shipping those feathers across the world for the feather trade. Numerous extinctions took place during this time. One of the most notable or one of the most excitable being that of the passenger pigeon. Passenger pigeon is actually what you see in this photo. That was the last one to live in the United States, and after this one died, there were no more. It's particularly notable because at one time, certain estimates are that there were 5 billion passenger pigeons in North America alone. They would see extinction due to overhunting in a matter of years. So this has kind of become the beacon for conservation in North America. All right, so where do hunters and fishers come in, or anglers come in? First of all, politically. We do like any other group. We see a problem when we address it with our elected leaders, and that's exactly what the conservationists did at the turn of the 20th century. So they saw the decline in numerous wildlife species, some of these most notable supporters being Theodore Roosevelt and a man named George Grinnell. They would come back after Theodore Roosevelt's failed buffalo hunt out west, and they would start what would become known as the Boone and Crockett Club. The Boone and Crockett Club was founded with the intention of being a group of hunters that had their hands essentially in everything to do with wildlife conservation, making sure the animals were rebounding, making sure that science was conducted to make sure that these animals were able to be sustained and they wouldn't see further extinctions. Other legislative pressure would come from hunters and conservationists such as Aldo Leopold, and would later on lead to the development of wildlife biology classes on a university system basis. So essentially, after the early 1900s, when hunters pressured the government into establishing wildlife regulations to curb hunting, so you had the hunters saying, hey, we need to do something, let's establish some regulations, rein back on them. You had other hunters saying, this isn't enough, we need to conduct more scientific research into the problem. All right, so the next thing is that political pressure is going to become a financial support. Hunters essentially were responsible for creating two of the largest impactful wildlife restoration acts to ever be passed through Congress. The first would be the Wildlife Restoration Act of 1937, better known as the Pittman-Robertson Act, which would create an excise tax on all hunting-related products sold. So every time you purchase a firearm, ammunition, hunting clothing, that goes to wildlife conservation, that excise tax does. Later on in 1950, the Federal Aid and Sport Fishing Restoration Act would be passed, or better known as the Dingell-Johnson Act. This act did the same thing as Pittman-Roberts, but it applied it to fishing gear. So every time you buy a fishing rod, a fishing lure, bait, a portion of that money spent has to go back into wildlife restoration or wildlife conservation. Financial again. Hunting and fishing license sales. They're used to continue that research, development, and those other conservation initiatives. As of 2017, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service reported that over $853 million in licenses had been sold, and this is just 1 year. Every one of those licenses, that money has to go back into wildlife conservation. So you essentially have hunters and anglers paying for the conservation that takes place. Last reason is hunters and anglers, they're hands-on people. They have those numerous financial projects. You have numerous habitat restoration and conservation. Any biologist today will tell you that one of the biggest problems faced by wildlife conservation is habitat. Ducks Unlimited alone has restored almost 14 million acres of wildlife habitat. Each one of these organizations, along with numerous more, are generously made up of hunters and anglers, and their support is what is funding and what is going towards this research and development in the area of wildlife conservation. All right, so in closing, I've highlighted some things out of this quote from the North American Model of Wildlife Conservation. This was a print published by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. A couple of real interesting things here that the Fish and Wildlife Service says. First of all, they point out that 60 and 90%, somewhere between 60 and 90% of all state and wildlife agency budgets are funded by hunters and fishermen. So it's going to vary some, but still, the people that are funding conservation are the hunters and the anglers. Second thing is that in terms of the North American model of conservation, clearly the success of the model is in no small measure indebted to the hunter and the angler conservationists from the U.S. government themselves. Thank you. Hope you enjoyed it. Have a good day.